Alright, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, to some extent, builds off of the ideas we find in Jodo Shu and Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. That's a foundation I don't want to get into too much detail on here, and the basics are things I already covered in the video on Jishu, which shares the same Jodo and CPL foundation as Shin. The reason I don't want to talk about them too much here is because I have them elsewhere on this graph, and I'll get to them eventually, and there's a lot of things I'd like to cover in more detail there. For now, suffice it to say that several of Mahayana Buddhism's most famous and beloved scriptures describe a Buddha named Amitabha, who vowed that anyone who sincerely believes in him and recites his name out loud will be reborn in a pure land of his creation where the obstacles to enlightenment do not exist. Now, recitation of Amitabha Buddha's name is called Niệm in Chinese, Yombu in Korean, Niệm Phật in Vietnamese, and Nembutsu in Japanese. Now, normally, Nembutsu is just one of, albeit usually the most popular among, a varied set of Buddhist practices. However, beginning in China and reaching widespread popularity in Japan, there's a movement called exclusive Nembutsu. Advocates of exclusive Nembutsu argue that, for most people, at least in this phase of world history, Nembutsu is the only effective Buddhist practice. Practices outside of Nembutsu, or broader Amitabha devotion, are at best useless, and at worst, distracting and indicate weak faith. The founding father of Japanese Nembutsu was a monk named Honen, whose students formed the Jodo Shu. One of his students was Shinran, and although Shinran absolutely did see himself as carrying on Honen's authentic teaching, his ideas were a little different from the rest of Honen's disciples, leading to the formation of a Jodo Shinshu sect, meaning true Pure Land sect, as opposed to Jodo Shu, meaning Pure Land sect. Shinran was born into a fairly well-to-do family near the Heian period capital of Kyoto. He was 9 years old when his mother died, and he was sent off to be a monk of the Tendai sect, which is also located elsewhere on this grid. Now, he trained on Mount Hiei, the holy mountain that serves as a kind of headquarters for Tendai Buddhism. He trained in the various esoteric and exoteric practices of that sect. He eventually, historians believe, probably became a special kind of monk called a doso, whose role was to practice near-constant Nembutsu recitation on behalf of wealthy benefactors. Shinran became restless and dissatisfied. Mount Hiei was like the Harvard of medieval Japanese Buddhism. He had received training in the most sublime methods of practice from the most renowned living teachers of Buddhism, but he hadn't achieved anything that felt like enlightenment. In an attempt to resolve this crisis, he entered retreat at a temple dedicated to Avalokiteshvara, or Guanyin in Chinese, Kannon in Japanese. During his practice there, Kannon appeared to him in a vision alongside Prince Shotoku, a member of the Japanese imperial family from centuries before, who had been instrumental in introducing Buddhism to Japan. They came bearing two messages. Prince Shotoku instructed Shinran to seek out the monk Honen and study under him. Kannon said that he would incarnate on Earth as a human woman, and in spite of the monastic restriction against starting families or taking wives, would become Shinran's wife. So Shinran left Mount Hiei and became a disciple of Honen. He studied Honen's teachings and the teachings of prior Indian, Chinese, and Japanese masters whose work Honen had synthesized. During this period, Shinran also married his wife, Eshini, who would become a major source of support and inspiration for Shinran, as well as playing a large part in preserving his teachings after his death. Eventually, however, Honen and his disciples were exiled from the capital for reasons I'll explain in more detail in the Jodo Shu video. They were scattered across Japan, and Shinran wound up in the Echigo region, in the northwest of Honshu, around the area of Niigata today. Even after his exile was lifted, Shinran remained for a few more years in Echigo, and after that did not return directly to Kyoto, but spent several more years preaching in the Kanto region, today the greater Tokyo metro area. Shinran's thought developed quite a bit during this time, and he gained a following among the rural poor, the peasantry. Having been exiled, and having rejected his monastic vows already by getting married, he no longer considered himself a monk anymore, but a simple man who was neither monk nor layman. He did eventually return to the Kyoto area, where he continued to preach and write before dying at an old age. His disciples and family would preserve his teachings and form the Jodo Shinshu sect, which today is the largest Buddhist sect in Japan. Let's talk a little bit about Shinran's unique teachings. Shinran saw himself, or at least portrayed himself, as carrying on Honin's true message. But whether this is true or not, it's undeniable that in terms of what exists in writing, Shinran develops Honin's ideas in a direction that isn't obvious in Honin's writings, and isn't present in the teachings of the Jodoshu sect. One example is the way that Shin conceptualizes Nembutsu and salvation. Generally speaking, in other forms of Pure Land Buddhism, the practitioner must generate 3 minds of faith in Amitabha concurrently with Nembutsu practice. One of these is the mind of sincere faith. Sincerity in this context means that your outward self-presentation matches your inward intentions and character. It's improper and compromises one's faith to display outward pretensions of holiness while being inwardly sinful. The second is the mind of deep faith. This is arguably the most simple. It just means that your conviction that Amitabha and his vow are real and can save you is deeply held. The third is the mind of merit transference. Merit in Buddhism is kind of like karma good boy points, and there's a belief that you can transfer the merit that you've collected to a certain cause or person. The third mind demand that practitioners go all in, so to speak, on Amitabha and the Pure Land by directing all the merit they have toward being born there. Nembutsu is, for most forms of Pure Land Buddhism, the cause of the 3 minds. The 3 minds are then the cause of being saved by Amitabha and brought to the Pure Land at death. Shinran turned this process upside down. For Shinran, the agency involved in being saved by Amitabha all belongs to Amitabha. First, Amitabha saves a person in accordance with his vows. Concurrently, Amitabha Buddha gifts that person the 3 minds, including the transference of his own merit to the practitioner. And finally, the practitioner recites Nembutsu in gratitude, and as the outward expression, the seal of having been embraced by Amitabha's vow. Now, this event in which a person is given faith by Amitabha Buddha is called Shinjin. Shinjin, I want to stress here, does not come from the practitioner, but is given by Amitabha as a gift. Shinjin is the heart of Shin Buddhism. You can kind of see why some people call Shinran the Buddhist John Calvin, but I do think this comparison jumps the gun a little bit. None of my reading of Shinran's work suggests anything resembling a limited atonement like Calvin has, in which Amitabha Buddha selects some people to bring to the Pure Land and not others. Quite the contrary, the relevant scriptures and the writings of both Shinran and his spiritual forefathers emphasize the universality of Amitabha's compassion. At the same time, they're pretty clear that not everyone will have the necessary faith to actually enter the Pure Land. How do we square the circle here? If faith comes from Amitabha, and faith is necessary to enter the Pure Land, and not everyone gets in, it seems like Amitabha is rejecting people, and thus his compassion isn't universal. Now, Shin Buddhist doctrine is vast and deep, and although Shin Buddhism is perhaps more of an influence on me than any other school of religious or philosophical thought, I can't say that I've exhausted every possible text that might contain something like an orthodox answer to this question. But I have spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I've seen other people discuss it. There seem to be a few common perspectives I'll share here. One of them is kind of to bite the bullet and say that, yeah, Amitabha does choose some people to save and not others, at least at any given time. I personally don't find this convincing. It seems to conflict with everything we understand about what a Buddha is, and the commentaries and scriptures about Amitabha and his Pure Land that Shinran was building off of. Another is to refer to karma. There's a lot of language about how a person with good karmic roots, a person without good karmic roots, cannot enter the Pure Land, not because Amitabha's vow doesn't work for them, but because a person without good karmic roots can't encounter Amitabha's vow to develop faith in it. This is pretty well grounded both in scriptural sources and in Shinran's exegesis, but it's a little more complicated than it sounds. The scriptures, and certainly the commentary of exclusive Nembutsu thinkers, are abundantly clear that it's not a matter of better people encountering Amitabha's vow, but a matter of having previously had some encounter with Amitabha or his believers, perhaps even coincidentally. It might also be genuine good deeds and merit collection done several lifetimes in the past and coming to fruition today. But at the end of the day, even very evil people, killers, thieves, can in this lifetime explicitly develop Shinjin and go to the Pure Land. We know that this is something that happens. This is one explanation that I'm willing to accept, but I do have some reservations. Mainly, it seems to limit Amitabha's power in a way that seems incongruous with what we see in Pure Land Buddhist philosophy and scripture. We know that Amitabha's ocean of merit is so strong that even, as I said, a killer, a thief, can go to the Pure Land. So it seems odd that it would be limited in the sense that if somebody doesn't have a karmic connection to Amitabha, he can't save them. But if they are a murderer, he can. I don't know. That's a little bit hard for me to swallow. The problem, of course, goes away if faith must come from the practitioner, as is, of course, the case in Jodo Shinshu and Chinese Pure Land, who can very simply just say, well, you either encounter this idea that you can recite the name or you don't, and that's dependent on your karma. The last mode of thinking is the one that I'm most sympathetic to, but I can see how it could be said to moderate and diminish the doctrine of absolute other power, of not relying on yourself and your own attributes, which is attributed to Shinran. I don't think that Amitabha's offering of faith as a gift that comes entirely from him necessarily negates the possibility of any choice on an individual level. I think that on some level, people could be able to choose to believe, but the choice to accept the gift is based on the possibility to believe, which comes from Amitabha. If you catch my drift, I'm trying to say that you can choose to believe, but the reason you even have a choice is because Amitabha offers this faith that would otherwise be impossible, because it isn't based on normal, discursive reasoning. It isn't necessarily intuitive. Now, I think that this approach makes a lot of sense in light of the doctrine of Buddha nature. Many schools of Mahayana Buddhism affirm that all beings are Buddhas to be, waiting to recognize their true Buddha nature. This goes hand in hand with the understanding of non-self and emptiness, which negate the ultimate self-being of any person. So at bottom, you just have this emptiness, which is the Buddha. So on this level, we do recognize that the distinction we make between the self and the self's power and Amitabha's other power is provisional. Necessary, yes, but still provisional. When we speak of Amitabha as other power, this can mean that he is other to the ego that we mistakenly recognize as us, while still not being outside of us. Much like Buddha nature, a latent aspect of all that exists which we can affirm at any point. It's important that we perceive him as exterior to the extent that he negates our sense of a permanent or independent self, but interior in the sense of his constant proximity and accessibility. As for the Pure Land, Shinran did not think that those who awakened true Shinjin truly needed to wait until death to go there. He felt that for somebody with Shinjin, death was basically a parinirvana. One would become a Buddha or at least a highly realized bodhisattva immediately. So the Pure Land was, on some level, if not entirely, a metaphor for the state of assurance of enlightenment, which is achieved not at death, but at the moment of Shinjin. There's a certain resemblance to Zen here, right? There's no practice that leads to enlightenment, only the direct and immediate affirmation of one's own Buddha nature. Shin Buddhism moderates by setting up a provisional system where Amitabha is in other power. But to be fair, Zen also moderates its claim to practiceless affirmation of Buddha nature. This is also the source of Shin Buddhist ethics. There are basically two kinds of actions from a religious perspective in Shin. Those are oso and those that are genso. Oso refers to transcending the world and moving toward the Pure Land. Genso refers to returning to the world from the Pure Land. I think that we can categorize the transcendental aspects of Buddhist teaching, That is to say, those that intend to transcend the samsaric world, those that might be accused of being life-denying as belonging to Oso. We must develop a certain distaste for the samsaric world and a longing for the Pure Land. But these elements of Shin and of Buddhism in general coexist with an eminentalist body of teaching. These demonstrate that samsara is nirvana, that Buddha nature is omnipresent, and so the Buddha is eminent in our world. After Shinjin, even after death after Shinjin, one does not leave the world behind permanently, but is in a constant state of returning from the Pure Land to assist suffering beings here and now, in a sense, actualizing the Pure Land on earth. Shin Buddhist ethics is an ethics of Genso. Many forms of traditional Buddhist ethics are teleological, toward the end point of becoming enlightened. You don't do things that will generate a karmic burden, and you don't do things that could dampen your mental clarity for meditative practice. These are ethics of Oso. After Shinjin happens, there's only the ethics of Genso, returning to the world from the Pure Land. This is not an ethics based on the calculation of merit, nor the teleological goal of self-enlightenment, but the guiding of others to liberation. That's why precept observance looks so different, or I should say, isn't really present, in Shin Buddhism. They're allowed to drink, for example, to eat meat, and their priests are not monks, they marry and have families. Other violations like killing, lying, or stealing are frowned upon, generally speaking, as uncompassionate and antisocial, but they aren't understood to threaten one's Shinjin, and one can imagine situations where these sins might be warranted from a Genso perspective. The principle at the base of Genso ethics is that of Jinen Honi, which basically means naturalness or spontaneity. Once you have Shinjin, you let Amitabha, your Buddha nature, transform you from the inside and guide you to the compassionate liberation of others. It's not totally unlike the Taoist principle of Wu Wei. There's no rulebook of ethics that includes all the potential compassionate activity of the Buddhas and excludes everything that a Buddha wouldn't do. You have to learn to flow with Amitabha's will enacted through you. Antithetical to Jinen Honi is calculation. Trying to calculate the merit of an act, or how it corresponds to one's own enlightenment, betrays a lack of faith in Amitabha's vow. Furthermore, because it is from a perspective of self-power, it is deeply fallible and will lead a person to do the wrong thing over and over. Shin ethics is in this way the kind of ultimate anti-utilitarianism. The unique and counterintuitive, albeit not antinomian, moral framework of Shin Buddhism set it up well to be the religion of the Japanese peasantry and early bourgeois class. There were, for example, around the Muromachi period, a number of anti-shogunate, anti-imperial rebellions held, to varying degrees, going case, by peasants, the early bourgeoisie, and sometimes minor aristocrats whose ideology was based in Shin or Shin derivative Buddhism. These were called the Ikko Ikki, and one of their emblems is actually the profile picture on this account. Because they eventually lost out to more powerful warlords and ceased to take place entirely by the beginning of the Edo period, we don't know a whole lot about the administration of the various Ikki that sprung up at various times and places. But I think it speaks well to the potential revolutionary application of Shin thought that it inspired these rebellions that, had they been successful, would likely have been historically progressive. Well, that about wraps up what I have to say about Jodo Shinshu. I myself would not identify as a Shin Buddhist, mainly because I don't entirely agree with the way that exclusive Nembutsu is applied traditionally in Shin Buddhism. This is a video about Shinran's ideas, and those of his successors, so I won't spend too much time talking about myself. But briefly, I do agree that it's unnecessary and counterproductive, at worst, to rely on practices outside Nembutsu as a means to enlightenment, but I don't think that all non-Nembutsu practices have an inherently soteriological purpose. There are worldly benefits and non-soteriological spiritual benefits to practices like mantra dharani recitation, meditation, precept observance, and so on that I think can be a part of Genso, post-Shinjin Genso, that I don't quite feel comfortable giving up on. That being said, hands down, Shinran is my GOAT Buddhist thinker, outside Shakyamuni himself. I can't recommend enough that you study his writings, and those of Shin Buddhist authors all the way down to the present day. I truly think that as an intellectual tradition, Shin Buddhism is the key to Buddhism's future and to its political and social application. Thanks for listening, and come back next time to hear about the Thai forest tradition.